So if you're in the room there, can someone pop up to the screen? And if there's a window that says, click got it, if you could just help me and click that. Hello, YouTube, everyone. We are getting ready to come at you live virtually from Gainesville and from Tuscaloosa. Is that where you're? Yep.
Yep.
Excellent. So just a moment, we're going to start the recording to the cloud, and I think we are ready to go. So thanks everyone for attending today. We have, this is our last W3 seminar before spring break, so we won't be seeing you next week, but of course we'll be reconvening after spring break. And today we are lucky enough to have Dr. C. Nathan Jones. So C. Nathan, what do you go by? I know you as Nate, but what do you go by in your profession besides Dr. Jones? What do you go by?
Nate works.
Okay. So we're going to be hearing from Nate today. So Dr. Nate Jones is an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. He received his BS in biological engineering from the University of Arkansas, where the mascot is some sort of, it's the Razorbacks, right? Yep. So a boar that is pretty important in driving wetland structure and function in the Southeast. So I don't know if we'll hear anything about that. Then he has his PhD in biological systems engineering from Virginia Tech, where he also served as a postdoc and then moved to the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. How do you say that? CSync?
CSync, yeah.
At the University of Maryland. Nate is an interdisciplinary water scientist focused on improving the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of water resources. And he's going to show us we're expanding some gradients in connectivities, like some upland wetlands all the way to large rivers, and it scales from individual soil particles all the way to watersheds. So a lot of his work crosses disciplinary boundaries, and we hope to hear like a broad survey of that today. So Nate, the floor is yours. Go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right, so I'm really excited to be here virtually with you guys today. I actually, I met, this is kind of a full circle event for me. David probably doesn't remember this, but in 2012, I was giving my first big conference talk as a grad student. And I think everyone remembers how nerve-wracking that is. And I went downstairs early in the morning to eat breakfast, and David actually sat down to eat breakfast with me. I don't know if there were no other chairs, or he saw, this wayward grad student probably really nervous. But since then, we've gotten to work together. In particular, I was fortunate enough to postdoc with Daniel McLaughlin, graduate of y'all's program. So I got to work with David and some other folks from UF during that time. So it's really exciting to be back here. In particular, this has to be the best Twitter ad for my work I've seen. So thank you again, David, for pushing that out. And this is for those of you who weren't here before the live stream started. My cats are Twitter famous. But to also, before we get going, today's International Women's Day, and I work with a bunch of awesome women, both in my lab and then as collaborators as well. And this is our field crew from a couple of years ago, and they're by far the hardest working and most productive field crew I've had a chance to work with. So shout out to them if any of them are watching. But for today's seminar, I'm going to give you guys a quick overview of my background, then talk about the conceptual framing for my work. And then from there, we'll dive into 3 case studies where we'll kind of dig into the data. And then if we have time, and that'll be a big if, because if you guys know me, I do like to talk a lot. We'll dive into the start of a conceptual model I'm starting to build for management purposes. And so David did a great job of giving you all my background. If there's time for questions, if there's students in the room that do want to talk about interdisciplinary career path, please ask those questions or email me, and I'm happy to talk about it. I started out in an engineering department. Now I'm a professor in a biology department, and it's really awesome, but it's definitely been a non-traditional career path. And working in wetlands, most of us are interdisciplinary just because it takes so many different skill sets to work on these questions and problems that we're faced with. I imagine there's folks in the room who will be have this similar zigzagging path that I have had. Let's go ahead and jump into the conceptual framing of what I do. I'm preaching to the choir here, but water resource management is one of society's greatest challenges, everything from drinking water to the energy sector and agriculture sector. And then what I spend most of my time thinking about how water or potentially the lack of water impacts ecosystems. In my lab, we really think about how upstream processes impact downstream waters. And so when I say downstream waters, I spent the first decade of my career working in the Chesapeake Bay. So both grad school and my postdocs, I was focused on how we could improve the water quality of the Chesapeake Bay. And now that I'm in Alabama, I'm focused on the Mobile Bay and specifically how we can improve the water quality of the Mobile Bay. And most of my work, or most of my labs and teams work, is upstream in freshwater systems, but still focused on improving the downstream water quality. And so to do that, we have a couple of conceptual frameworks that we like to think about. The first is the natural flow regime. This is really common in the aquatic sciences. And essentially, the flow regime, it consists of the magnitude, frequency, duration, timing, and rate of change of flow in the stream. I like to compare this to a band. And as an engineer, I was always taught to think about the extremes of the flow regime. So the floods and droughts. So we predict floods. I'm a homeowner, so I do care about the maximum flood extent. That's really important because I don't want my home in that, or I don't want to buy a home in that flood extent. And also because I drink a lot of water, I want to think about drought. But the critters, the fish, and the macroinvertebrates and other components of the ecosystem, they care about those other pieces of the variation. And so you can't have the band without all the pieces. The White Stripes is one of my favorite bands. They have this great bass line, but that bass line wouldn't be what it is without other supporting instruments in the background. I'd like to highlight that we need to think about the entire range of variation there. And so when we think about or when we think about the flow regime, one way this has been operationalized is environmental flow science. I know David has a lot of work on this in South America with the Amazon basin, and there's probably other folks in the room as well. And so this is where we can actually control some of the flow regimes, or sort of control the flow out of the outlet of the dam. An example of a change in flow regime is the Glen Canyon Dam that I just showed. And this is the flow of the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. And when we put the dam in, there's an obvious change in that flow regime. And it's had definite implications for both the geomorphology of the system and the associated biota. But that's not what I'm talking about today. That's kind of where the science is, and where I hope our team and the collaborators I work with, and you guys, Daniel, I watched his talk and he talked about distributed storage. And so taking ideas that from Daniel in particular, thinking about the spatial distribution of this variation. So variation in inundation, not just at that point of a stream gauge, but also thinking about it up throughout the watershed. And then near and dear to my heart, and what our lab thinks a lot about, are also variation in different fluxes. So thinking about surface water, groundwater connectivity, and how that changes across space and time. Now, pulling in, that was digging deep into the aquatic science literature, digging deep into the hydrologic literature. Hewlett and Hibbert from 1967. This is thinking about the variable source area concept. So essentially how saturated zones expand and contract over the course of a rain event. This is really foundational to a lot of our hydrologic modeling and a lot of our conceptual models of how our river systems work. But at the end of the paper, they present this hierarchical model of drivers of stream flow. And if you're a biologist in the room, you might say, hey, this kind of looks like filtering for organisms. And it absolutely is. It's a similar hierarchy, but instead of thinking about filtering for organisms, it's thinking about this hierarchy that drives different variations in our flow regimes. And at the top of that's climatic drivers. So if you're in Arizona, you have a very different flow regime than you do here, maybe in the Floribama area, since y'all are in Florida and I'm Alabama. Very, very different flow regime. Also, you have a very different or geologic setting, right? You guys are dealing with this crazy karst aquifer that scares the hell out of me to try to think about. And in Arizona, they have sandstone aquifers, so very different. They're very different routing mechanisms. And then when you think locally about how your watershed is plumbed, thinking about where water is stored and how it moves between those storage volumes. And so up to this point in my, in my group's work, we've really focused on this, where is water stored on the landscape and how does it move between those storage volumes? And I take a very Eulerian approach to this, influenced likely by, all the great folks at UF, but we draw control volumes around these storage zones, and then we connect them with arrows and do lots of perceptual modeling exercises that way. And so we'll get back to this throughout the rest of the presentation. But the fundamental questions our group is asking is, can we develop predictive relationships between drivers of hydrologic variability and downstream function? And how do we use that information to better manage our ecosystems? And this is where the ecological engineering comes in from my title. Okay, so let's dive right into the case studies. And so I want to start with Headwater wetlands. This work, I started this with Daniel, and there's a lot of overlap between our presentations. So y'all can let me know how much of this differed and maybe how much I'm presenting that's wrong. But first, I've been able to work on 3 great teams for this work. The first was part of a Powell Center effort that I think actually originated at UF. And then the second, after working with Daniel as a postdoc, I went on to the Palmer Lab at UMD and took some of the modeling tools we were using and applied them to empirical data sets and started collecting those. And then finally, we actually kind of combined those 2 groups and formed the Delmarva Disco team. If you see hashtag Delmarva Disco, that's actually that's our group on Twitter. And we're just ending that project this year, or at least the funding cycle's ending this year. Okay, so why do we care about hydrologic variability in wetlands? I use this term, I'm preaching to the choir. I know I really am here, but it is worth reminding ourselves every once in a while. First, I grew up in Arkansas. Duck hunting is a way of life. It's also a driver of the economy. My uncle, he was a duck hunting guide. That's what he did for a living. So it's very important for certain economies. We also know that wetlands are hotspots for biodiversity and biodiversity resources. And they're incredibly important for nutrient removal, especially in agricultural settings. And finally, wetlands are really, really important for global scale carbon cycling. Not only do they store carbon in their organic soils, but also, as we'll talk about, they're important sources of methane as well. There's been pervasive wetland loss. This is from that Powell Center group in 2017. They looked at wetland loss across each state, and places like Florida and Alabama, we've lost over half of our wetlands. My home state has lost, in Arkansas, we've lost over 3/4 of our wetlands. Likely due to rice farming is my guess. And then places like Maryland, we've lost over 3/4 of our wetlands too. And so not only have we lost those wetlands, we've lost the important functions they provide. And so that's a lot of our work is motivated by that. And so that conceptual model that I presented earlier, that hierarchy, I'm going to walk for the rest of the presentation. You'll actually see it on the left-hand side of your screen. And I'm going to walk through that hierarchy in each one of these examples. So if you get lost, just check out that bubble on the left, and hopefully that will orient you to at least kind of what we're talking about. So our first question is, how do inundation regimes vary across headwater wetland archetypes? And so for this work, we chose three kind of famous headwater wetlands, prairie potholes. So these are in the northern Great Plains, Delmarva and Carolina Bays. These are really near and dear to my heart. I've spent the last 6 or 7 years working in these systems. And then in a system I've never gotten to visit personally, but I've heard a ton about, are cypress domes. And obviously those are quite important to you guys on the logo of the Wetland Center. So, and so for each one of these these wetland archetypes, we use the wetland hydrologic capacitance model to simulate the inundation variability. This is a model that Daniel and David started and they put together. And my job as a postdoc was to take their spreadsheet model, which it was amazing what they could do with that spreadsheet, and then code it up in R. And it took me 3 months to do that because that spreadsheet was so complex. And honestly, incredibly impressive that they were able to do what they did and excel with that. And then we started to tweak it. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about the model, although please ask me questions because I can geek out about this all day. But it's essentially a bucket model and we're moving water between different buckets. And so we don't have a ton of time to dig into the results. So I'm going to jump straight to the chase. What we did is we took wetlands we randomly selected HUC 12s from each region, and then we selected wetlands. We parameterized the model for all the wetlands in that HUC 12 using publicly available data sets, and then we simulated the wetland water level in those wetlands for 1,000 years. And so what you're seeing in this plot is an example of that. And the line here, to orient you to this graph, on the y-axis is the wetland water level. Above zero is inundation, below zero is the water table elevation, and so it'd be dry if it's below zero. And then this line is going to be much smoother than a normal wetland water level plot because it's the average across those 1,000 simulations. So at a Julian day of 1, that's the average wetland water level for a single wetland across 1,000 years. So again, this is going to be a much smoother plot than most of you are expecting to see. And so when we look across these 3 wetland archetypes, we see very different timing in the inundation. So in the prairie pothole region, and again, each one of these really faint lines is one wetland, and there's roughly 600 to 800 wetlands on each plot. And then the dark line is the average from across those wetlands to kind of show what the signal is like. In the prairie pothole region, you actually see this increase in the spring, and that has to do with snowmelt runoff. And so you have the spring freshetta that really it's incredibly important to keep these wetlands hydrated. In Delmarva, we have this, most of our wetlands go dry towards the end of the water year in the October period. And that's what we see empirically as well. And then in South Florida, we see a much faster drawdown and also a much earlier drawdown. And the point here is that across these different regions, there are differences in geology and there's differences in physiographic variables, but the main difference is the timing of both precipitation and evapotranspiration. And so what are potential drivers of this? And so we did a sensitivity analysis on the different variables. And it's really important that we're careful with these results because, and Matt Cohen said this to me one time, and it's really stuck with me, that our models are just informed hypotheses. And that's something that I really hold true. And I try to explain in all my presentations where we're using modeling results. So this is all in modeling space. And so, we need to test these things before we can only take this inference so far is what I'm trying to say. But so when we look at surface water fluxes, on the x-axis, these are the different model inputs, and on the y-axis is the relative sensitivity. And so we're looking at what variables are most sensitive to, or what variables surface water flux out is most sensitive to. And as Daniel talked about in his presentation, that variable is really important. That the duration of surface water flow is really important for regulatory purposes. And so when we look at this, what we see is that KSAT, so the saturated conductivity of the shallow subsurface, and the watershed area, the area draining to that wetland, are really sensitive parameters in our modeling space. When we look at groundwater fluxes out, because in our model we do have groundwater leaving the watershed, we see that confining layer depth, or essentially the control volume for that wetland is really sensitive. So the more subsurface storage capacity you have, or that subsurface storage capacity is a really important variable for the amount of water that's able to leave these really small headwater catchments. And then finally, when we look at surface groundwater exchange, which is, it's really important to a lot of us in thinking about carbon fluxes and nitrogen fluxes in these wetlands. We see that it's much more complicated, and there's not one single variable that's necessarily driving that variation within the modeling space, at least. Now, when we zoom into local scales, what variables are driving this inundation, or this variation at local scales? How are our watersheds plumbed, and what's driving that variation? And so to do this, we collected an empirical data set, and I'm sure Daniel talked to you guys about this. This is the Delmarva Peninsula study, the Delmarva Disco study, and we have 18 wetlands that we've instrumented with pressure transducers. A subset of those we've triangulated piezometers in the upland as well. And most of our wetlands are pretty small. And it's really important to note that they go dry pretty regularly. This particular wetland, when I took this picture, this wetland is fairly geographically isolated. When it spills, the ephemeral channel kind of disappears into the forested area. So it doesn't necessarily directly connect to a channel, but nonetheless, when I walked up to the center of this wetland, that little puddle right here was full of fish. It was crazy, really wild. And since then, apparently, one of the students was telling me there's fish that can actually like survive in mud for months at a time, which is pretty cool. But that's not the point of this talk. Beyond the fact that most of our wetlands are pretty small and they do go dry regularly. And so this is what a regular year looks like. We kind of have this rising limb of the hydrograph starting in the beginning of the water year till winter period. During this elevated period, this is normally when the wetlands are connected to downstream waters. They're spilling to a ditch network usually. And then we have a drawdown, and sometimes that drawdown is interrupted by things like hurricanes or large storm events. We actually had an atmospheric river this particular year happen. So we had a lot of water that year. And so some of the things that we saw that drove this hydrologic variability, the first is depth of the confining layer. So does that wetland actually have access to the superficial aquifer? And we found that mean water level actually decreased as you increased elevation. So again, if we go back to this plot, the higher this wetland is along this hill slope gradient, the lower the water level was throughout one given year. And it is worth saying that the gradients we're talking about are relatively small. In meters, we're going from essentially across 6 meters. So this is an incredibly flat landscape, although you guys are in Florida, so y'all are used to that. We also see that wetland size plays a big role in this variation. These two wetlands, they're two of my favorite wetlands. The top one's actually named Nate's Bay, so maybe there's some selection bias there, but they're adjacent to each other and it's the same elevation. So you would expect them to have similar hydrologic variability, but what you see is the smaller wetland is much more variable than this larger wetland. So that larger wetland has a much more stable hydrograph. And when we look at the coefficient of variation across our sites, we actually see that water level variance, it does decrease with wetland size or maximum wetland size. And then finally, we have this storage capacity metric. I developed this using Huaisheng Wu's level set method. It took me quite a while. These landscapes are incredibly complex, and the nested natures the nested nature of these wetlands are difficult to characterize. And so we use this hierarchical graph theory approach that Huaisheng put together. He's actually at the University of Tennessee in the geography department. Yeah, if anybody wants to talk about this, I would love to hear how other folks are dealing with the complexity of these landscapes, because I spent the better part of 2 years developing this code, and it's still not perfect. But when we calculate watershed storage capacity, or the storage capacity of the wetland divided by the watershed area, we do see that there is a significant, albeit weak, correlation between those two. So as you increase storage capacity, you have a slower recession. I know there's at least a couple of folks in the room that are excited about wetland hydrology, but that is a fairly small minority of us, I assume. But these the variation we see in these inundation patterns or these inundation regimes, they do have consequences at the landscape scale. And so what I want to talk to you a little bit about is how this impacts methane emissions. So we instrumented this hill slope gradient from the wetland edge all the way up to the top of the upland. And along that gradient, not only did we measure water level, but we also we measured several variables: carbon storage, methane emissions, CO2 emissions, all kinds of things. And again, today I'm going to stick to the methane emissions, but we're able to capture how this variability impacts those different variables. And so Kelly Hondula, who's now a research scientist at ASU, her dissertation focused on methane. And what we found with her, as many others have found, is methane's really complicated. And so the only thing that she was really able to say with her research is anytime that we saw methane emissions, it was usually because there was inundation. And so that's what you see in this plot, methane emissions on the x-axis. And again, you have both positive, so that's emissions, or negative, so uptake on the y-axis, and then water level on the x-axis, and inundation occurs above zero. And so again, the only time that we really saw emissions was when there was inundation. And so Kelly took this and she used some really neat remote sensing tools and modeled inundation across our landscape. And she actually used planet data. If anyone's familiar with that, we have these cube satellites that's the size of a shoebox, and there's 300 of them orbiting Earth at once. And so you get this really high resolution imagery of your site every 3 to 5 days. And it's free to university researchers, which is really awesome. And so she actually, using planet data, was able to begin to look at inundation patterns of these really small wetlands. And what you'll notice here is, so this is the measured inundation in black, and then her modeled inundation in red. And what you can see is she did a pretty good job during wet season and dry season, but where she's missing out is during the shoulder season. So right at leaf on and leaf off, the models that she was using, it was a deep learning model of the image analysis, and it really fell apart there. And the point I want to make is not that Kelly's models weren't good, but it's that this is the best we've got. And so there's tons of room for improvement for imaging inundation under forested canopy. And in a second, you'll see why that's important. So Kelly developed these deep learning models, and then using the inundation estimates, she looked at how different size classes of wetlands, if we include them in wetland emissions models, impact our emissions estimate, or methane emissions. And so what you see here, and I think this is the most important thing that I'm going to talk about today, and the thing that I really hope that you guys take home, is that when you include the smallest wetlands in your emissions, you get this huge bump in methane production. And so wetlands are the biggest piece of uncertainty in the global methane budget. A lot of that is because we don't know how to estimate their extent. And Kelly's work really highlighted that. And we were working a really focused watershed versus these regional and global scale models. But the point here is, if you're not including these little wetlands, especially in these low gradient wetlandscapes, you're really missing a lot of methane fluxes. So this is, again, probably the most important result that I'm talking about today. And so how do we manage these wetland inundation regimes? And on Delmarva, we plug the ditches. So most of the wetlands on Delmarva have been ditched through colonial ditching, actually all the way back to colonial times. There was ditching for mosquito control, and then more recently agriculture, or modern agriculture. And so to restore these wetlands, we literally just plug the ditch. Of course, that doesn't do everything that we need it to. It restores the hydrology, but the microbial communities aren't necessarily coming back behind the hydrology. And there's whole groups of people working on that. And So we have this great group of students at Virginia Tech that are working on these things, and I don't want to steal their thunder, but there's several papers that are either just came out. Katie Wardinsky published a paper like in the last 6 months, and Carla and Nick also have papers in prep, and so be looking for their work because it's really exciting, and this is a really great group of students. Okay, so that was our headwater wetlands. Moving on to non-perennial streams. When I use the word non-perennial, I really mean ephemeral and intermittent streams. The definitions of those are kind of blurry, so it's just easier to say non-perennial. I've gotten some flack for that in the past, where someone's like, "Well, if I've got an orange, I might call it a not apple," and that's fair. But regardless, that's the terminology we're going to use today. And this work largely comes out of two really great teams: the Dry Rivers RCN group that started very serendipitously right before the pandemic. And a lot of the work I'll present today comes from them. And then the Ames team, which is an EPSCoR funded project that actually was an outgrowth of the Dry Rivers RCN. So something, as I started this work several years ago, that was really shocking to me: the majority of our global stream miles go dry on a regular basis. So Matthias Messenger wrote this paper a couple of years ago, and they suggested that over 60% of our stream network, by length at least, goes dry on a regular basis. And we know from local scale studies that this absolutely has an impact on those ecosystems. These ecosystems, this drying is a really strong filter for species. It absolutely has to have an impact on at least the local scale biogeochemistry. But what we don't understand is that from a network scale, how do these systems, what forcings are they exerting on downstream waters? And so that's really what these two groups are focused on understanding. And so how do non-perennial flow regimes vary across regions? Similar to the wetland work that I showed at this large scale, we see that the timing of drying occurs at different times. So this is work from Adam Price, recently published in GRL. But what you see is these black lines are the proportion of stream gauges that go dry on a regular basis. And you see the timing of this drying is very different. So here in the east, where we have a lot of gauges actually in Florida that were included in this data set, we see that if gauges are going dry, they're happening at the end of the water year, which is very different from the much more predictable drying pattern that we might see in the Mediterranean climate of Southern California. John Hammond, who does a lot of really great work in this space, he led a paper where we looked at metrics of these drying and how drying varied regionally. And he specifically, these are plots of the mean annual value on the left and coefficient of variation on the right. And there's a lot going on in these plots, but what I really wanted to highlight here is that we see, we see a lot of drying in the Southwest, and because it's drier there. So a lot of our gauges focus on where we have the most gauges on these systems that dry regularly is in the Southwest, and we also see a lot of the larger values in mean no flow fraction, for example, happening in the Southwest. But that doesn't mean it's not happening here in the Southeast. We just don't have as many gauges in those systems. The other thing that John did is he used a random forest model to interrogate the potential drivers, and the size of these bubbles, or it's the error induced by not including that variable. So he pulled that variable out of the model, and then how much error was induced by pulling that variable out. What you see that's really important here is that at this mean annual time scale, climatic variables are really important. Right. And we would expect that's that. But again, this is, when we talk about the hierarchical drivers, this is at the top. Sam Zipper, who I think actually gave a presentation a couple of years ago on this particular work, he looked at changes in these three metrics across the regions. And one of the things that really popped out to us is that here in the eastern forest, we're actually going to get drier. Or we are getting drier, which highlights the need to better understand these systems, specifically here in the Southeast. And so what are potential physiographic drivers of these non-perennial flow regimes? If you thought that we beat this data set to death, wait, we have one more paper. Adam Price actually looked at, so before we were thinking about the annual time steps, right? So what's mean annual averages? Adam actually, he looked at components of individual flow events. And so we call these the drying regimes. We're flipping the script from the flow regime, so to speak. And we had roughly 25,000 events that we put into a cluster analysis based on these 5 drying events. If you're excited about that, I encourage you to read the paper. But what I really want to talk about is we used a random forest analysis to look at what variables drove the classification of those events. And in particular, we found that land cover and water cover were important variables classifying those events. And it's not necessarily that land cover is important, but if an area has a lot of wetlands, what does that mean about that landscape? Well, it's probably poorly drained, likely really flat. And so those are likely important physiographic drivers of that area's hydrology. Just like the previous, I want to drive into the local scale. And this work is primarily led by my PhD student, Delaney Peterson, and Corey Tattery, who is a postdoc with Behzad Mortazavi. We're all Hokies, so we always wear our Hokie gear when we go into the field together, which is kind of fun. But this work is at the Tanglewood Biological Station, so we're in the upper coastal plain. So we do have topography in the upper coastal plain, but it is really sandy with intermittent clay layers. It's kind of like the rest of the coastal plain in Alabama, at least. And so Delaney's dissertation, or at least her first chapter, focuses on looking at the horizontal, vertical, and longitudinal dimensions of hydrologic connectivity. And specifically today, I want to focus on her horizontal results. So we see 3 dominant hydrogeomorphic units in this part of Alabama, and they kind of always occur in a specific succession. We have these deeply incised channels that are occurring for various reasons, and one of which is we have highly erodible soil and this legacy of poor land management practices. And downstream of these incised areas, we often have these depositional zones that result in these really cool riparian, anamystosing stream complex things. I'm not really sure what to call them. And then downstream from there, we kind of get this normal stream with a typical bed and bank structure that you'd expect. And then it does it all over again until we get to larger rivers where we get this incision, and eventually we drop into a bottomland hardwood forest. And so Delaney's actually looking at the horizontal connectivity component and the hill slope going to these three, or at least 3 locations in these hydrogeomorphic units. And these are just the cross sections that we surveyed from those 3 places that are field sites. And you can see, we go from a gully to a wetland, and you can see the width to depth ratio kind of increases as you move down. And so this is she's got 3 wells in each location. And so this represents the mean annual, so it's the mean water level from 1 year. So this is actually real data across that transect. And in the gully, what you end up seeing is that, at least the mean behavior or the median behavior of that data is that the gradient's always going from the upland into the gully. When we look at the typical, you actually see that the stream is typically losing. So it's water's moving from the stream into the riparian area. And then finally, when we get to this wetland, and this shouldn't be a huge surprise, we're kind of at equilibrium, and that just suggests that the water table is sitting, that fluvial aquifer, the water table is just sitting at the wetland surface there. These plots are looking at variation from mean across our different wells at each transect. And what we really want to take home from this is the gully, there's a lot of variation in the water level there in those transects. Whereas when you look at the wetland, you have a lot of synchrony between the stream and the water level. And again, that's likely because the water level in the wetland area is probably driven by that superficial aquifer. We also did some geophysics here, and this is really exciting work that we're hoping to build on in the next year or two. But when we did ERT at the top, we think that the driver of the signal is actually our water sources, because this is a really wet landscape. And we think that these areas of blue are actually groundwater upwelling zones. These are areas where we have a lot of iron. And so we sampled these for both water isotopes and dissolved solids, and they were very different than the areas that we sampled in yellow. So we think that these yellow areas are primarily like soil moisture derived from precipitation, whereas this blue color is likely more, we think, is upwelling of groundwater. However, I've ruffled some feathers by saying that, so take that with a grain of salt. And then our chargeability results, we're still trying to figure out how to interpolate the wells, the soil cores we took when we took these samples, but we really think that these suggest that there's discontinuous clay layers. And what's really exciting, so using this as preliminary data, we actually got a DOE grant funded, and that we started in September. And I'm actively in the process of interviewing for postdocs for this position. So if there's anyone in the room, it's not too late to apply for that. So let me know if you're interested. We're actually looking at how surface water and groundwater partitions both carbon and nitrogen fluxes at the wetland and watershed scale in this landscape. And yeah, it's already been a ton of fun. I think we've installed 50 wells already this year. We've got a ton of biogeochemistry work that we're going to start this summer. Okay, with my remaining time, I want to talk about floodplains. And so when we think about flooding and floodplains, we often think about flood risk, right? I'm a homeowner. I need, I don't want to live in the flood zone, but also floods provide function. And so my group interacts with both of these components of flooding, flood risk, specifically thinking about flooding and its impact on drinking water wells, work closely with Kelsey Piper at Northeastern. But today, I actually want to talk about the functions that floods provide, and specifically thinking about bottomland hardwood forest. And so to quickly walk through this hierarchy of drivers that we've been discussing, we can see the timing of flooding across CONUS changes by region, similar to the results if we compare the Pacific Coast area to perhaps South Central or Southeast. We see very different flooding regimes. And also in this particular paper, something that we tried to do was quantify the amount of water that's moving through the floodplain, like the proportion of water. And we see that the proportion of flood water that moves through the floodplain and potentially is processed varies anywhere regionally from 4% to 12% or more. We also looked at how floods varied across stream order, kind of drawing on the flood pulse concept a bit. And one thing that was really interesting is that, at least according to the metric we developed, that the flood water fraction that moves through the floodplain actually decreases proportionally with stream order, which is we weren't expecting. Now we're only going to 7th order streams, so maybe that changes when we get to our largest streams. But still, we weren't expecting that because I work in a mid-order bottomland hardwood forest, and there's a large volume of water that sits in that bottomland hardwood. But according to this analysis, proportionally at least, you're getting a lot more contact in your floodplain in these headwater streams. So we need some more empirical work to actually prove that, but nonetheless, it was an interesting starting point. And so I want to jump right into how do these floodplains impact ecosystem function. My master's student who recently graduated, Matt Shockey, he's now a high school teacher in Birmingham, Alabama. He spent all summer looking at both installing shallow groundwater wells and also collecting tree species data. And the goal of his research was to quantify the impact of hydrology on tree species. I'm going to skip the hydro part and jump straight to his results. He found that this metric hand, height above nearest drainage, or maybe another way to say this is height above bankful, was a really strong predictor of tree species. And so to calculate hand, it's a pretty simple raster analysis. I'm happy to share code. But essentially, as you walk out of the floodplain, your hand is going to increase, right? But it's different from an elevation value in that it's relative to the nearest stream. So you're comparing apples to apples. So if your flood height's a meter, and your value hand is 1.2, well, you're dry. But if you're 0.8, then you're wet. And so when we look at wetland indicator status across hand, it's exactly what you would expect. At lower values of hand, closer down to the stream, you have obligate wetland species. And then as you move to facultative upland species, as that hand value gets higher, you have more facultative upland species. We didn't really get a lot of facultative upland species in this survey because we were primarily in the floodplain. The upland becomes farmed pretty quickly in this setting. When we look, we put our species composition into an ordination, and when we put vectors across that, we see that both hand and inundation duration pop out, and they're actually almost orthogonal to each other, which is really interesting. And in this space, suggests that maybe we could use hand as an indicator, as a tool for restoration, especially in places where we don't have good inundation data, because most folks don't have 10 to 20 years of inundation data at a site they're working at. And so Matt developed, he used a mini GLN model to predict species composition of his plots. And I can talk a lot about how he did that. This was a bootstrapping approach where he pulled out 20% of the data. He developed his models with 80% of the data, then validated it with 20% of the data. He did that 1,000 times. And for the most part, his model was pretty good. He was able to predict species composition for most of the species within this absolute error is actually stems. So within 4 to 5 stems per plot, which was really great. And from that, we used a trait database to actually model ecosystem functions across his floodplain. And we're really excited about this result. Not necessarily, it makes pretty maps and that's fun, but potentially this could be a tool for restoration. We've got some work to do to scale this up to perhaps the Mobile Basin itself. But we can't scale our current results up because we're at the reach scale, of course. But we are excited about the potential for this tool, not only to prioritize sites for bottomland hardwood forests, but also prioritize conservation of currently existing bottomland hardwoods. And yeah, these are, as most of you guys know, bottomland hardwoods are really special places. They're near and dear to my heart. And I'm really fortunate that, this site's 20 minutes from my house, so I get to go all the time. And it's a special place. So with that, briefly touch on the conceptual model that I'm building. So I kind of talked about this hierarchy of drivers of hydrologic variability and the impact that has on management. But of course, as you guys know, ecosystems ecology really outgrowth of the ODMs, and you guys are more well-versed in that history than I am, but we know there's feedbacks. And so what I really want to start thinking about is how and at what spatial and temporal scales to use different types of engineering interventions. That's really where I'm hoping to take my research over the next few years. And with that, I think I'm over time. So I really appreciate everyone coming today and listening.
Thanks, Nate. Let's give a round of applause, real and virtual. Thank you very much. And let's see, I've muted everyone in the room, so I have to unmute you guys here. Am I all right? Let's stop the share. And we'll go to questions in the room. So thanks for whoever's up there unmuting. Appreciate it. We'll start with questions in the room, and I'll see if there's anything from YouTube. Let's start in the room. Here. Not hearing anything from the room. Y'all, was there a question? Nope. All right, well, I'm going to ask a question then, Nate. So especially in the sort of attribution of like physical climate or physiological climate drivers, and I'm sure you've had this question a lot, but there's a lot of, well, the expectation that the aridity or the precipitation to ET regime is going to be this huge thing. But it's also co-varies with all of the other sort of landscape scale things, like whether it's cultivated or not. Like we don't cultivate the desert because it's hard to grow, for example, unless you're irrigating. So how did you address all of this, like probably super multi-collinearity among those drivers when trying to figure out which is important?
Yeah, Well, so that's a great question. The cop-out answer is that's why I put this slide in here, is because the feedbacks between those were my PhD student Delaney, that's her work is thinking about variability across scales and drying, and developing kind of hierarchical models for that. And that's a good question. I don't know how we address that besides agreeing with you. Absolutely. There's, not only is there the collinearity there, but there's also the landscape evolution that led to, the physiographic variables and the storage and connectivity that we have as well. That's absolutely not something we've necessarily worked out completely.
Yeah, it's like a co-evolution process of it, like that the land cover and the land use is co-evolved with the precipitation and ET regime. And yeah, we've gotten knocked by reviewers on that and other things as well. So I'll pass on a question from YouTube from Amin, which I assume is Amin Fidan. She asks, what are the implications of smaller wetlands being huge sources of methane?
Well, so the first one is that, our methane budgets, our global methane budgets, have this huge gap. And we're arguing that gap is at least partially that these wetlands are partially responsible for that gap. And so that's the first answer. I think the second answer is that so we were actually initially funded by the state of Maryland to help them compute a methane budget, and that's not possible because the level of uncertainty that these wetlands impose. So I think if we're trying to manage our systems for methane and manage everything from industry to our wetlands and thinking about incorporating wetland into our methane budgets, we have a lot of work to do.
All right. Any other questions from the room? A lot of scales and a lot of systems. I know I tasked the students who are enrolled for a credit to write an abstract. So good luck getting all of that content into your less than 1 page abstract. Summarizing is okay. All right, well then let's give one more round of applause to Dr. Jones and his cat. Thank you so much for joining us today. Y'all are off next week, and we will see you back on the 22nd for Dr. Sanjay Shukla from UF Ag and Bioengineering. That seminar will be in person in the room, and we will see you then. Thank you very much. Nate, stay on for a second and just say thanks in chat.